What if I told you that some of the most important soldiers in World War II never fired a single bullet? What if the men who saved thousands of American lives during some of the bloodiest campaigns in Western Europe were artists, sound engineers, and advertising executives? And what if their greatest weapon wasn't a rifle or a tank, but a carefully crafted lie? Today, we're talking about the Ghost Army. Officially designated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, this was a unit so classified that its existence wasn't declassified until 1996. For over 50 years, the men who served in it couldn't tell anyone what they did. Not their wives, not their children, not their closest friends. They carried the secret of how they helped win World War II in complete silence. But the story of the Ghost Army isn't just about grand strategic deception at the level of generals and war rooms. That's how most people talk about it when they talk about it at all. What I want to focus on today is something more immediate, more human, and honestly, more terrifying. These men were regularly deployed right at the front lines, sometimes just a few hundred meters from German positions, to pull off deceptions that were designed to draw enemy fire away from real American troops who were pinned down, outgunned, or at serious risk of being overrun. This is the story of how a fake army saved real lives. And when you hear the details of what these guys actually did, you're going to find it almost impossible to believe it worked. Let me set the scene for you. It's 1944 and the Allied forces have successfully landed in Normandy. The breakout from the beaches is happening and American troops are pushing through France. But the German military isn't just sitting there. They're adapting, repositioning and hitting back hard wherever they can identify weaknesses in the Allied line. Every time American commanders needed to shift their real forces from one location to another, they created a gap, a vulnerability, a potential target. And the Germans were very good at finding those vulnerabilities. The solution that American military planners came up with was audacious. Instead of trying to hide the movement of troops, what if you replaced them with something that looked exactly like troops? Not just a visual fake either, a complete multi-layered illusion that would convince German intelligence, German aerial reconnaissance, and German ground observers that a full-strength American force was exactly where it needed to appear to be. The Ghost Army was built around 4 distinct capabilities, and when you understand each one, the audacity of what they did becomes even more impressive. First, there were the inflatable tanks. Yes, you heard that right. The unit deployed rubber and canvas decoy equipment, including tanks, artillery pieces, jeeps, and even aircraft. These weren't cheap carnival props either. They were carefully designed to cast the right shadows when viewed from above, to show up correctly on aerial photographs, and to present a convincing silhouette to anyone observing from a distance. A Ghost Army deployment might involve setting up dozens of these inflatable vehicles in positions that suggested a full armoured division was staging for an attack. Second, there was sonic deception. The Ghost Army operated powerful sound trucks that could broadcast pre-recorded audio of troop movements, tank engines, construction activity, and all the acoustic signatures of a large military force preparing for operations. These recordings had been made with obsessive attention to detail, capturing the actual sounds of real equipment, so that the audio would hold up to trained military ears. At night, when visibility was low and sound carried further, these trucks could create the sonic impression of an entire division moving into position. They could be heard up to 15 miles away under the right atmospheric conditions. Third, there was radio deception. The unit employed skilled radio operators who had spent time carefully studying and memorizing the communication styles, the timing patterns, and even the individual quirks of the real units they were impersonating. When the Ghost Army took over from a real division, their radio operators didn't just send the right messages, they sent them in a way that was consistent with how that division's operators had always communicated. German signals intelligence was sophisticated enough to notice if communication patterns suddenly changed, so the deception had to go right down to the human level of how individual operators typed in Morse code. Fourth, there was visual deception carried out by the men themselves. Ghost Army soldiers would drive around in marked vehicles, wear the shoulder patches of the units they were impersonating, and conduct themselves in public spaces, towns and villages as if they were part of those real formations. They wanted to be seen. They wanted local civilians to see the patches, hear the unit designations being used, and potentially pass that information along through channels that German intelligence was monitoring. It sounds counterintuitive, but deliberately being conspicuous was part of the strategy. Now let's talk about what this actually meant in practice. Because the tactical reality of Ghost Army operations was far more dangerous than any summary makes it sound. When a real American unit needed to be pulled out of a position, maybe because they'd taken casualties and needed to consolidate, maybe because commanders needed to redeploy them for an offensive somewhere else, the Ghost Army would move in to fill the apparent gap. They would set up their inflatables in the positions where real tanks had been. Their sound trucks would begin broadcasting, their radio operators would take over the communication frequencies, and their men would start driving around looking as much like the real unit as possible. Here's the terrifying part. The Ghost Army typically numbered around 1,100 men total. The units they were impersonating might be 2 to 4 times that size. They were creating the impression of a force that was dramatically larger than anything they could actually field. And they were doing this in positions that German forces were actively watching, probing, and sometimes shooting at. There are documented cases where Ghost Army soldiers were captured by the Germans and subjected to interrogation. The secret held. The men in the unit understood that if they broke under interrogation and revealed the deception, not only would that specific operation fail, but the Germans would know the technique existed and would be looking for it everywhere. The stakes of maintaining the lie extended far beyond any individual mission. Let me tell you about one of the most dramatic examples of the Ghost Army in direct action. In September of 1944, real American forces were stretched dangerously thin along a section of the front. The 6th Armoured Division needed to be pulled out of line, but doing so would create a gap that German forces could potentially exploit. The Ghost Army was deployed to replace them. They set up their inflatable equipment in the positions the real armoured vehicles had occupied. Their sound trucks went to work after dark. Their radio operators seamlessly continued the communication patterns of the 6th Armoured. And then they waited, right there in the dark, a few hundred men pretending to be an entire armoured division, hoping the Germans wouldn't probe too hard before the real forces could reposition, and the deception would no longer be needed. It worked. The 6th Armoured moved successfully, the line held, and German forces never exploited the gap because, as far as German intelligence could determine, there was no gap. There was a fully equipped American armoured division right where it was supposed to be. Now multiply that kind of operation across an entire campaign. The Ghost Army conducted approximately 20 major deception operations between their arrival in Europe in May of 1944 and the end of the war in Europe in May of 1945. Military historians who have studied the unit's activities estimate that their operations may have saved anywhere from 30,000 to 40,000 American lives. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 30 to 40,000 men who came home because a fake army told a very convincing lie. But I want to go deeper on the human element here, because I think this is where the story gets genuinely extraordinary. The Ghost Army was, by design, filled with creative people. The army had specifically recruited artists, designers, architects, and men with backgrounds in advertising, theatre and radio. The reasoning was practical. Pulling off a convincing large-scale deception required people who understood visual composition, who could think about how something would appear from multiple angles and distances, who understood the psychology of creating an impression. What this meant in practice was that the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops contained one of the most remarkable concentrations of artistic talent in the history of the United States Army. Among its members were men who would go on to become some of the most significant artists and designers of the post-war period. Bill Blass, who became one of America's most celebrated fashion designers, served in the Ghost Army. Ellsworth Kelly, whose abstract paintings now hang in major museums around the world, was a Ghost Army veteran. Arthur Singer, the illustrator, was there. So was future fashion illustrator and designer Bill Weber. These men spent their days setting up inflatable tanks and their evenings sketching the French countryside. They painted in abandoned buildings. They kept detailed sketchbooks of everything they saw: the ruined towns, the exhausted faces of French civilians, the surreal contrast between the beauty of the European landscape and the destruction being visited upon it. Many of them later spoke about the strange creative intensity of that time, how the proximity to death made everything feel more vivid, more worth capturing. There's something deeply moving about this aspect of the story. These were men who chose to express what they were experiencing through art, even in the middle of a war, even when they couldn't tell anyone what they were actually doing. The sketchbooks and paintings they created during their service form a remarkable visual record of that campaign, a record that was hidden, along with everything else about the unit, for decades. But back to the tactical reality, because it's important not to romanticize what these men went through. The Ghost Army was in real danger on a regular basis. The nature of their work required them to be in places that were, by definition, likely to attract enemy attention. If you're deploying where a real armoured division should be, you're deploying somewhere that the enemy is going to be looking at, probing, and potentially attacking. In one particularly harrowing incident near the Moselle River, Ghost Army units found themselves under artillery fire from German positions that had apparently detected or suspected something. The men couldn't fight back effectively because doing so would have revealed how few of them there actually were. They had to hold their positions, maintain the deception, and hope that the fire was speculative rather than targeted, and that the Germans weren't about to commit infantry to test the line they were supposedly holding. Think about what kind of discipline and mental fortitude that requires, to be under fire and to know that your defensive capability is essentially non-existent, to know that your job in that moment is not to shoot back, but to maintain an illusion. The Ghost Army soldiers understood that their value came from the lie, not from their firepower, and that breaking the lie, even in self-defense, could cost more lives than it saved. Let's talk about the radio deception aspect in more detail, because I think it's one of the most underappreciated parts of what made the Ghost Army effective. Modern audiences are pretty familiar with the idea of fake tanks and sound trucks. Those elements have gotten the most attention in documentaries and articles about the unit. But the radio work was arguably the most technically sophisticated part of the operation, and it's the part that required the most sustained human performance. German signals intelligence, particularly the organisation responsible for monitoring Allied radio communications, was genuinely skilled at their work. They tracked not just the content of messages, but the patterns. Which units communicated on which frequencies, how often they transmitted, at what times of day, and crucially, the individual transmission characteristics of specific radio operators, what signals intelligence professionals called the operator's fist, a reference to the distinctive rhythm and style with which a trained Morse code operator would tap out their transmissions. Every skilled Morse operator has a slightly different touch, a personal rhythm that experienced listeners can identify, the way you might recognize a friend's voice. German signals intelligence had been listening to American radio operators long enough to build profiles of individual operators in specific units. If a unit's radio suddenly went silent and then came back on with a different operator's characteristic style, that was a red flag that something had changed. The Ghost Army radio operators studied the communication logs and recordings of the units they were replacing. They practiced mimicking specific operators' styles, and when they took over a communication network, they worked to produce transmissions that were consistent with what German listeners would expect to hear. It was an astonishing level of performance, essentially acting through the medium of Morse code, and it had to be sustained over days, or sometimes weeks. The men who did this work understood that a single inconsistency, a transmission at the wrong time, a slightly different rhythm, an unusual pause before answering a routine inquiry, could alert German intelligence that something had changed. And if German intelligence flagged the change, they might investigate more aggressively. They might push harder to probe the line. They might direct artillery at coordinates they'd been avoiding because they thought a strong armoured force was there. The radio operators carried the weight of those downstream consequences every time they sat down at their equipment. Now, I want to address something that sometimes gets glossed over in discussions of the Ghost Army, which is the ethical and psychological complexity of what these men were doing. There's a tendency to talk about deception operations in fairly clinical, strategic terms. We moved these units here. We convinced the Germans that force was positioned there. The result was that X number of casualties were avoided. But for the men who were actually conducting the deception, the experience had a much stranger texture. They were professionally trained to create false realities. They were rewarded when the enemy believed something that wasn't true. The more effectively they lied, the better they were at their jobs. And they were doing all of this in a context where the consequences of success and failure were measured in human lives. Several Ghost Army veterans who spoke publicly after declassification described a particular kind of psychological displacement that came with the work. You were always performing. You were always thinking about how you appeared, what impression you were creating, what the observer across the front lines was concluding from what you showed them. It created a strange relationship with reality, particularly when the performance had to extend to interactions with local civilians who might be passing information to German intelligence. You weren't just deceiving the enemy, you were deceiving everyone around you, all the time, as a professional obligation. Some veterans described feeling invisible in a way that went beyond the tactical secrecy of their unit. They felt like the nature of their work made them somehow less real, or at least made the boundary between their real selves and their performed selves harder to locate. The artists in the unit found that their existing creative practice gave them a language for processing this. Painting and sketching were ways of reasserting the reality of their own perceptions against the constant professional requirement to manipulate the perceptions of others. Let's look at one more specific operation, because I want to give you a sense of just how elaborate and risky these deployments actually were. Operation Bettenburg took place in Luxembourg in the fall of 1944. The Ghost Army was tasked with creating the appearance of a major American force concentration in an area where commanders wanted German attention directed. Real American forces were preparing to move elsewhere, but if German observers picked up on the movement and redirected their own forces to follow, it could compromise an operation that was critical to the broader campaign. Ghost Army units moved into the designated area. The inflatables went up. The sound trucks began their nightly performances. The radio operators took over the relevant frequencies, and the men drove through local towns and villages, displaying the insignia of units that were actually 50 miles away. But here's the detail that makes this operation particularly striking. The commanders of the Ghost Army operation were informed that German infantry patrols were actively operating in the area and had already been seen moving through some of the same villages where Ghost Army soldiers were conducting their visual deception. The risk of direct contact was real. The Ghost Army soldiers continued their operations. They had to. Pulling back would have collapsed the deception at a critical moment. So they drove their jeeps through those Luxembourg villages, wearing the patches of units they weren't, broadcasting by radio as units they weren't, and hoping that the German patrols were feeding their observations back to intelligence analysts who were drawing the conclusions that Ghost Army planners intended. The operation worked. The real American movement was concealed. German forces remained oriented toward a position that contained a few hundred men and a collection of rubber tanks, instead of the far more vulnerable actual operation that was underway. I want to step back and look at the broader significance of what the Ghost Army represents, because I think there's something important here that goes beyond the tactical details. The Ghost Army demonstrates something fundamental about the nature of military power. We tend to think about military force in terms of weapons, numbers, and logistics. More tanks, more artillery, more troops. But the Ghost Army showed that perception can be at least as powerful as material reality in certain contexts. What the enemy believes about your strength and position can matter as much as what your actual strength and position are. This isn't a new insight in military history. Deception has been part of warfare since the beginning. But the Ghost Army represents an unusually sophisticated and sustained application of the principle, and it's particularly striking that it worked against an adversary as capable as the German military of 1944. The Wehrmacht, by that point in the war, was fighting on multiple fronts, stretched thin and aware that Allied deceptions were being conducted against them. They knew about the broader Allied program of strategic deception, the operation that had convinced them that the D-Day landings at Normandy were a feint and that the real invasion was coming somewhere else. They were, in other words, on guard against exactly the kind of operations the Ghost Army was conducting. And the Ghost Army kept fooling them anyway. Operation after operation, the multi-layered deception held up. The combination of visual, sonic, radio and human elements created an impression that was just convincing enough, just often enough, to protect the real forces behind the illusion. Part of the reason it worked was exactly because the Ghost Army thought about deception holistically. A visual decoy alone is fragile. If the enemy doesn't see any radio traffic, or if the sonic environment doesn't match what you'd expect from a real unit in that position, the visual evidence starts to look suspicious. But when all the sensory and intelligence channels are telling you the same story, the story becomes very hard to disbelieve, even if you're trying to stay skeptical. This is actually consistent with what we know about human cognition and persuasion. When multiple independent sources appear to confirm the same conclusion, our confidence in that conclusion increases dramatically. The Ghost Army was exploiting a fundamental feature of how intelligence analysis works, the tendency to weight convergent evidence heavily. They weren't just creating one fake signal. They were creating multiple fake signals that appeared to independently confirm each other. There's something almost elegant about that when you strip away the life and death stakes. But of course, the stakes were exactly what they were. And that brings me to what I find most remarkable about the Ghost Army story. These men volunteered for service, knowing they would be in dangerous positions, knowing their defensive capability was essentially minimal, knowing they couldn't tell anyone what they were doing, and knowing that if their deception failed, the consequences would be measured in the deaths of real soldiers they were trying to protect. They weren't infantry. They weren't trained to fight their way out of trouble. Their entire defensive strategy was the deception itself. If the lie held, they were protected by the enemy's uncertainty. If the lie broke, they were 1,100 men facing forces that might be 3 or 4 times their number, armed with rubber tanks and sound trucks. The bravery required for that is a different kind of bravery than we usually celebrate in stories about World War II. It's not the bravery of charging a machine gun nest or holding a foxhole under artillery bombardment. It's the bravery of performing a theatrical deception while you know exactly how catastrophic the consequences of a bad performance would be. It's sustained, intellectual, creative bravery, maintained over months across 20 major operations, in conditions that were often physically miserable and always genuinely dangerous. Some Ghost Army veterans said afterward that they almost preferred not knowing exactly how often they'd been in serious danger during their service. The full picture only became clear much later, as records were declassified and historians began piecing together what had been happening on the German side. There were moments, the veterans learned, when German commanders had been seriously considering testing the positions the Ghost Army was holding. There were moments when the Germans had been just one aggressive reconnaissance push away from discovering the truth. The Ghost Army didn't know it at the time. They were operating in the fog of war like everyone else, uncertain whether their deception was holding, uncertain whether the German activity they could observe nearby was routine or the precursor to something more serious. They maintained their performance through that uncertainty because the mission required it. The fact that the story stayed secret for 50 years adds another layer of weight to all of this. When these men came home, they couldn't process their experience with anyone who hadn't been there. They couldn't explain to their families what they'd done or why it mattered. They couldn't receive the recognition that would have helped confirm that what they'd gone through had been worthwhile. They just had to carry it. And many of them did carry it, quietly, through the second half of the 20th century, watching World War II become one of the central myths of American culture. Watching films and books and documentaries celebrate the soldiers who fought and bled on those fronts, knowing that they had been there too, that they had done something that contributed to the outcome, and that they couldn't say a word. When the story finally came out after 1996, many of the surviving veterans were in their 70s and 80s. They were finally able to talk, finally able to show their sketchbooks and paintings, finally able to explain to their children and grandchildren what they had actually done during those years. The documentary made about the unit and the subsequent recognition it received gave them something they'd waited decades for: acknowledgement. For some of them it came too late. Enough veterans had already died carrying their secret that the full human story of the unit will never be completely told. But enough survived to give us a window into this extraordinary corner of World War II history. And what that window shows us is something that challenges the way we typically think about warfare, about valour, and about what it means to serve. The Ghost Army saved lives not through superior firepower, but through superior imagination. They understood that in war, as in so many other human endeavours, what people believe can be more decisive than what is actually true. They turned that understanding into a discipline, a craft, a practice refined across 20 operations over 12 months of some of the most intense fighting in Western Europe. And they did it while sketching the countryside, while making friends with French and Luxembourg civilians, while carrying secrets they couldn't share, while sitting in dangerous positions in the dark, listening to the sounds of a real war happening very close to their elaborate, fragile, brilliant lie. The Ghost Army was officially recognized by Congress in 2022 with the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States government can bestow. It came 78 years after they started doing the work. Better late than never. But it does make you think about all the ways we manage to overlook the most interesting stories of courage and creativity, because they don't fit neatly into the categories we've already decided matter. History is full of ghost armies, people and operations that shaped outcomes in ways that weren't visible at the time and weren't celebrated afterward. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops just happens to be one of the cases where the story eventually surfaced, where the records were eventually opened, where the veterans eventually got to speak. What strikes me most, coming back to where we started, is that question about what kind of courage we value and recognize. We build monuments to the men who charged beaches and held positions under overwhelming fire. We should. Those men deserve every monument we build them. But somewhere in that story, there should also be room for 1,100 artists, designers, and radio operators who drove through enemy territory wearing the wrong patches, broadcasting sounds into the night, maintaining an elaborate fiction under fire, knowing that 30 or 40,000 men were coming home because the lie held. They were a fake army, but the lives they saved were real. And I think that's worth knowing. If this story surprised you, if you'd never heard of the Ghost Army before today, I genuinely encourage you to dig deeper. The 2013 documentary, simply titled The Ghost Army, is an excellent starting point, and the accounts from veterans who are finally able to speak after declassification are some of the most remarkable oral history recordings to come out of World War II research. These men had a lot to say. They just had to wait a very long time before they could say it.